Welcome back to the 76 Capital Sports Leadership Show. My name is Wayne Kimmel, managing partner of 76 Capital, the sports tech venture capital company. On this show, I interview top sports entrepreneurs, athletes, and executives who are shaping and many times changing the sports industry. We have put together a series of shows to dive into the transformation and professionalization of college sports. My guest host is Ken Shropshire, the man who wrote the book on sports business. You probably know Ken from his several decades of running the Wharton Sports Business Program at the University of Pennsylvania and leading the Global Sport Institute at Arizona State University. Please subscribe to our show on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on our 76 Capital website to never miss an episode. Our guest is Jason Belzer, who is a lawyer, entrepreneur, professor, and NIL pioneer who has helped shape the future of college athletics through his work at SANIL, AthleticDirectorU, and is now a venture partner at a private equity fund. Jason, welcome to our 76 Capital Sports Leadership Show.
Thank you for having me, Wayne. I've watched maybe more of your episodes than anybody else, so it's a true honor to finally be able to be asked to be a guest.
Well, Ken and I are super excited about this series, really talking about the future, the present, what's going on across college sports. And, I think to kick it all off, Ken and I were talking about you and your involvement in so many different pieces of this. And we'd love for you to break it all down for us. I mean, you've been involved on the rules side, the regulations side. You've looked and dug deep into the lawsuits and the challenges over the years. And now here we are with the House settlement. We think we're sort of settling in. Well, maybe not, but we'll see. And certainly things have recently been tweaked. But where do we stand today, and what are your views on what's going on?
Yeah, so we are at the precipice of, and I thought that was 4 years ago, but we've made a little bit of progress, and now we are truly at the precipice of what will be the biggest change in the history of college athletics and maybe the model of sports in the United States and globally. And so just to give a little bit of background so that listeners can know where I came from, I was a college athlete. I was a walk-on football player and track athlete at Rutgers University. Wanted to represent student athletes. This was 20 years ago, and obviously you couldn't do that. So I said, I'll do the next best thing and represent coaches. And so started an agency out of my dorm room at Rutgers, and got into the business of representing college basketball and football coaches. Was 21 years old, didn't really know what I was doing. But because of the nature of college athletics, in the sense of, number one, very small industry, very incestuous. You only have 350 Division I universities. You have a very small group of people that are managing and running the business. The NCAA is very hands-off. The conferences are doing sort of what they want to do. It was possible for somebody as young as I was to be able to come in and sort of put a wedge into the business. One of the first things that I look back at as an accomplishment was that I started in a college basketball tournament in law school called the CIT. I was 22 years old, started an event that eventually went to 32 teams, became the largest privately run college sporting event in the country before the formation of the CFP. And it was possible because, again, there were no rules, right? There is nothing that says you can't start a college basketball tournament. There's not really a rule that says you can't start a bowl game. If you have enough money, you can pretty much do anything in this industry. And that really sort of was my thesis as I continued to build my practice and build my brand in the industry. And so 4.5, 5 years ago, as NIL started to become a reality, I recognized that this was going to be an incredible opportunity. And it was going to be an incredible opportunity because there was going to be a tremendous amount of chaos. And the analogy that I used 4.5 years ago was the analogy that I use today, which is my family immigrated here from the former Soviet Union. My wife was born there. In 1991, when the former Soviet Union fell apart, you essentially had a country that went from state-owned, the government owned everything, to privatized. The country was bought up, oligarchs were created, all of that. That's essentially what is happening in college sports right now. And what I mean by that is that you had an industry that was essentially operating in somewhat of a lockstep with one another over the last 100 years. And because of the commercialization that has occurred, and especially because of the rules and the no rules that were around over the last 4 years around NIL, universities, athletic departments, and conferences specifically are saying, how do we do better than our opponents? How do we differentiate ourselves? And that is now what is leading to these conversations around the formation of a potential super league, the break off of the power leagues to others, the formation of other entities in all of this, and also the entrance of private capital into this industry, which would be it will be radically transformative. And so the reality is that as of today, we are at this precipice where student athletes over the last 4 years in aggregate made approximately $1 billion in NIL earnings, $1 billion over 4 years. Of that, 80% was from collectives. And the majority of the money that were coming from collectives were coming from donors. So essentially what it was synthetic NIL. This was pay for play through collectives. And the rest of it, $200 million, was real NIL, real brand opportunities, whatever that may be. Starting today or this month, July of 2025, these athletes are going to start making over $2 billion a year in revenue share. And that is only going to go up. So the total addressable market over the next decade of NIL earnings is going to be somewhere in the $25 to $30 billion range. So massive, massive earnings potential. But what that's really going to do is that is going to transform the entire youth sports ecosystem in the United States and the entire paradigm that every parent and every family thinks about when it comes to sports. I, as a walk-on football player at Rutgers, could graduate today and earn probably $500,000 in revenue share just being on the roster of a Power 4 team and never playing a down. And so when we think about what's going to happen with families and youth sports and recognizing, oh my son or daughter can go to college, get a scholarship, and walk away with life-changing money and probably earn, in many instances, more money than the parents are earning at that point, the youth sports market is going to explode. It's a $35 billion industry right now. It's likely to double over the next decade. So $30 billion for athletes to earn over a 10-year period, but the youth sports market is going to be a $30 billion increase on a yearly basis. So when we think about what's going to happen in our country and internationally, because we obviously are the global developer of talent for international student athletes that are coming here, tremendous opportunities. And because of that, there is going to be a tremendous battle for who's going to own it. And the reality is that at the end of the day, the NCAA, maybe they are part of what this looks like 5 to 10 years from now. I don't know if that's going to be the case, because at some point when you have the SEC and the Big Ten that are valuable properties, combined valuation, I think based on the numbers that I did for CNBC last year, was about $23 billion. I mean, it's likely that that could double within the next decade just between the media rights and all the other ancillary opportunities. So a super league in many ways can come close to rivaling the NFL in terms of value, and people are going to want a piece of that.
Well, there's certainly no doubt about that. Ken?
So Jason, you're proving yourself to be the perfect starter guest for this series that Wayne's putting together in terms of your descriptors of the entire ecosystem and what the concerns are. I'm going to try not to keep going with your Soviet example, because I'll probably go way off the rails in trying to make analogies. So let me not.
Well, it's an example that didn't go well for everybody involved, which I think is an important lesson.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And I think we'll hold on to that part, and a lot of what I think will be valuable for people viewing this is how they can be successful in this space, in this new ecosystem that you described, and maybe even more bluntly, how they avoid having disasters. So let's start with I think the people we should care about the most. So let's start with the athletes. And before you went in the direction you went, I was going to talk about college athletes and kind of sit there, but you make it clear that we should be concerned about how we educate the youngest of athletes. And I guess, not to steal your answer, we might think about starting with the parents in that instance. So how do you see this whole getting the labor in this whole process, getting them up to speed as to what their value is, what their worth is, and how to get it in this new ecosystem?
Yeah. So great question. Over the last 4 years, I negotiated almost $100 million in NIL contracts, which to my knowledge is the most of any person on the planet up until this point. That will rapidly change once, some of the GMs at Ohio State and others really start moving. Yeah. So that was over approximately 2,000 student athletes, 50 different institutions. I can publicly say that in almost every instance, those athletes were not represented by an attorney or an agent or anyone else. In the very instance that they were, the majority of those representatives were highly unqualified to be considered a representative of a student athlete. Either they were a parent that did not have the legal background, an uncle, more often than not an AAU coach, or some other third-party individual. Maybe in 5% of those situations, it was a competent agent from a CAA or an Athletes First or a WMME.
I mean, my question is, it's the same level of person that was advising on the old letter.
Oh, absolutely, right? This is not anything novel. This has been going on for the history, right? Sonny Vaccaro has been talking about this for decades. So now the challenge, though, is it's not a scholarship anymore. It's real money. And these athletes have no concept of what's happening here. I have a 14-year-old nephew. He is a really talented basketball player in New Jersey. I think he has a chance to be a high-level Division I player. He has random people that will go to his 8th grade basketball games and solicit kids to sign with them to be their NIL agent. How does a 14-year-old kid even know what NIL really is, what college looks like, all of those things, much less their parents? And the other piece of this is, I mentioned $1 billion to student athletes over the last decade. The vast majority of that money has gone to Black athletes in disadvantaged, difficult socioeconomic strata areas of the country where there's little access to education. In almost every instance, those kids are first-generation college students. And there is nobody that is doing anything to be able to advise those athletes to create some sort of structure and rigor around this process to say, this is what you need to understand. This is how you navigate and determine whether or not somebody should be representing you, actually has your best interest in mind, all of those different things. The NCAA does not want to get involved in that because they don't want to get sued. Right. The universities, ironically, are just not incentivized because in the reality is they want to get the best deal possible. So if the kid has incompetent representation, it actually benefits the university long run. And so the reality is that unless somebody steps in and says we have to create some sort of system in which we can educate student athletes at scale, create some sort of agnostic source of truth where all of this information is out there, where we can cut out the bullshit that is coming from these coaches who will sell kids anything to get them to sign on the dotted line and show up at their school on the first day of class. We need to figure out how to create truth and transparency in this business and this industry. That is part of what I am working on in the next venture that I am going to be building. But even if we're successful at what we're doing, it's going to require the institutions, the conferences, the players' associations. It's going to require a lot more than just a few altruistic people that want to try to educate these kids. Otherwise, we're going to end up with kids making money, and we're going to end up with a lot of sad stories about kids that, just like we hear with the NFL, how many kids go broke. Imagine how many kids are going to go broke or burn through all of this money before they ever start their life. And that's a really unfortunate thing to happen.
So just quick follow-up analogy. So maybe even worse than what you're talking about. This is kind of like the Dominican baseball players, the idea that agents, more control now than it was historically, but going in there and signing kids at the youngest of ages, and where a dollar is worth so much more than a dollar is worth to the typical kid in the States, and the percentages mean nothing, but the idea of the opportunity to play professional baseball is what took charge there.
That's right. Yeah, I'll give you two examples as it relates to that. Number one, in this, I gave that statistic about how many of these kids were not
Right.
represented. But as part of that, we did a little bit of research, and it's not rocket science. When we talk to an agent, I would ask one of our legal interns to pull a list, contact Attorney General's office from one of the states and say, hey, can you confirm whether or not this person is registered under the Uniform Athlete Agent Act? 95% of the time it was the kid, they were not registered, right? And so in some instances, in some cases, that's a felony. And those individuals are still continuing to negotiate and now negotiating with legal counsel from schools, even though they're not technically licensed to do so. What's even more interesting is that we had multiple situations in which an agent would negotiate a contract, maybe do 10 minutes of work, and then turn around and say, oh, by the way, as part of this contract, I need you to pull out 20% of the payments and send them to me. Now, first of all, they're getting paid 20% to do effectively nothing.
Yeah.
But even more scary was that we would say, okay, and then we would call the student athlete and say, are you aware that they're asking us to pull 20% of the money that is owed to you? And they'd say, oh, no, I thought he was charging me 10%. Now, that's not my problem, right? Because I'm working on behalf of the institution. But that is a problem because it's pretty clear that they're getting kids to sign. The kids are probably not even reading their representation agreements. They don't even know what they're giving up. Before they give it to the school and give something up, they don't even know what they're giving up with this agent. And then the agent is basically effectively doing nothing and getting paid for it. And there have been a lot of people that made a lot of money. And this is not to throw any particular person under the bus, but there have been a lot of people that have made a lot of money over the last couple of years just signing kids at volume and then trying to represent them. There are agencies, you can go on LinkedIn and Google and find agencies that are now representing 200 college basketball players. Talk about, how do you manage conflict of interest? What competency are you actually providing them? What relationships do you have to be able to actually, how do you know what market value is? And the schools are not any better in this. I released data that showed that Power 4 schools are spending 5 to 7 times the amount of money for the same recruits as the lower level institutions are at the G6 and FCS level, primarily because they have no access to data, but they have larger pools of capital to be able to deploy into their rosters. So they're just throwing money around. And of course, when there's money to be had, you have nefarious people that come in and say, this is an opportunity for me to make $1. So unless somebody creates some sort of licensing system, unless somebody creates some sort of way to police all of this, it's not going to change until the school or somebody else gets sued because of what's happened. And I know we have a conversation here, but I have plenty of stories to talk about how close some of these institutions are to being sued for negligence, because all they care about is, oh, kid needs to get paid. We'll do that, and we don't care what happens, who they're being represented by, how that process even went under. So.
Yeah, I mean, to sort of follow up and sort of maybe talk a little bit about what has changed this year, right? So we had this House settlement. We have now direct pay from the universities to the athletes. We've had it where it's gone through the collectives, as you were talking about. What do you see? What's going to happen here? Because you only have a certain amount of money that can be directly paid. You
Right.
have the collectives that now seem like they're going to continue to be playing in this game.
Yep.
How's this all going to work out?
Yeah. So, what has changed? Nothing has really changed. In fact, we've actually, at this very moment, we've kind of taken a step back or digressed. And what I mean by that is that we had a system that worked really well, and now that system kind of got imploded, and now we are restarting because these institutions are now making these direct payments. Now, there are many institutions that don't even have a capacity at this very minute at the Division I level to make those payments. They have not signed with a third party, whether it's a Teamworks or a Scout or a Blueprint or whatever, to even make those payments. So there are some schools that are like, I don't even know what we're doing. And some of them are still, the ones that I've signed an example with Blueprint is handling that. So they don't even know how they're doing their accounting or their payroll. They just know we have $10 million and that's what's happening here. As it relates to what's going to happen, there either has to be some sort of collective bargaining that is going to occur with these athletes that create some sort of structure, and it doesn't have to be employment. It could be a collective bargaining without employment. There needs to be either that, an employment status, and whether or not either of those happens, I can guarantee you that there has to be some sort of commercial operating entity that will likely end up holding the rights to these contracts at a higher level. That likely will be the league level at the power leagues, meaning the SEC, the Big Ten will eventually figure out, hey, we are going to manage all of these contracts, similar to, I think Major League Soccer has a similar system where the athlete contracts are held at the league level versus the actual team level. And at the FCS level and the G6 level, where those institutions have even less resources, less capability and sophistication, that is even more important, right? Because otherwise, you're just going to have all this crazy movement. You have the transfer portal, which means total free agency, which doesn't work, right? There's a reason why the NFL is such a great product, because there's parity, and a kid or a player can't get up one year and say, I'm done, I'm going to go play somewhere else. It's ridiculous, right? It's actually comical. Somebody has to be able to solve for that. I'm not quite optimistic that the Congress is going to grant the NCAA an antitrust exemption either.
So just a little more definition on that. I think where Wayne may have been going, I mean, these deals with PayPal and Venmo, the idea that there's not somebody in the middle, that's problematic in the same way as...
Yeah, I mean, look, what is the deal with PayPal? PayPal is paying the Big 12 $20 million a year. They're functionally processing payments. They don't have a sophisticated processing setup, right? So they might be SOC 2 compliant and whatever, but if you look at their dashboard that they're offering, they're basically offering nothing, right? They're just saying, we're going to process. The schools, instead of thinking long-term and saying, hey, do we want to make, does this work? They said, oh, we can make $20 million and we're going to go actually do this, which is ironically why some schools, I'll give you an example, Iowa State, which is in the Big 12, has chosen to go and sign a contract with Scout and actually pay Scout and say, we don't need PayPal. We actually need a more sophisticated way to think about, what if we have to find a player? What happens if we find a player and then 2 years from now they graduate and decide to come back and sue us and say, you didn't fulfill my contract? Who's going to manage that for them, right? All of these schools are so quick to try to pay these athletes. It's the same reason why all of these schools ask their collectives to empty their bank accounts. And now a football team is making $40 million instead of $20 million. Well, what's going to happen if there's a lawsuit or we end up going to collective bargaining and everybody says, well, wait a second. Last year I made $2 million, but now you're asking me for $1 million this time? I don't think that's going to work. Do you think the schools were thinking through that process when they decided to just pay kids?
And that's the front loading. That's recently happened, right? That's
right. And the last thing I'll say is that in 2032, when these contracts expire, these television contracts expire, the SEC and the Big Ten will be making approximately $105 million a year per school in media rights distribution. The Big 12 and the ACC will be closer to 55 to 60 million. So do you really think that the SEC and the Big Ten are going to be fine with sitting on a $25 million cap then, when they know that they have 2x the amount of dollars that they can spend with their athletes as these other institutions? That's never going to hold. Like, why would you want to? That's like the Yankees agreeing to a salary cap in baseball because, you know, the Oakland A's and the Kansas City Royals want to stay competitive. That's not how free market economics work at the end of the day. They'll just break off and do their own thing and pay their kids more, and they'll get the best talent for it.
So we haven't. We're still in the Soviet Union here. We haven't gotten much brightness in terms of effectively how to make the improvements that need to be made. And you mentioned collective bargaining, so we might as well talk about that for a moment, because that I think those of us who've been in sports for a while know that could be the lever that helps to move things in the right direction. That there is this concentrated representation of the labor in this whole process, but it's one of I've stopped saying it's I never said it was impossible or it couldn't happen. I thought this whole idea of greater compensation flowing in the direction of athletes was not going to happen. I thought that for so long until 5-6 years ago. I said, oh, this may actually really happen. So, but I do feel pretty, can this really happen? Can there really be a recognized union in college sports that can address this issue and really combat toe to toe this greater power base of the people that hold the money?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is I do believe that it can be, which is why I've backed athletes.org. I believe in their mission. I think
we got a positive from you, so that's a good thing.
So yes, I'm not all pessimistic. I'm not all, but I also think that that's a top-down approach. What I am focused on is the bottom-up approach, which is how do we start with younger kids and say, fine, reset. Let's start with the 14-year-olds, and we got 4 years to prepare them to get to an environment in which we can create some stability here. The problem is, and again, I don't want to be pessimistic, but the reason why Danny White is saying, hey, here's a collective bargaining process, we can do this. And then there are people in his league and maybe even his commissioner that are like, we don't even want to talk about collective bargaining, right? Because they're just so competitive with one another that they can't even come to the table and say, hey, maybe if we just did this, yes, it may mean that some of the people that we don't want as part of our group are going to have a better advantage, but a rising tide lifts all ships, right? And so I don't know. I don't know how this is going to happen. More money is going to come in, but I also know that you need a competitive product. If you want to compete at the highest levels and you want to drive the most revenue, and if you're going to have a product, you need to know that your talent is going to show up on Saturday and actually do what you want them to do. And they're not going to just turn around and say, we're out, right? Or we're not getting paid enough or whatever. And so if the private equity firms are going to come in and make these types of investments, they're going to want some sort of guarantees too. And they're going to say, we need to put a structure around this.
We've been really talking about, as you just referred to, as Saturday afternoon and college basketball, right? In your view, what's going on with all the other sports, and how do you figure this all out?
Yeah, I think that obviously football and basketball drive everything. And the reality is that the model at the Olympic level will change. I do think that there is a tremendous amount of untapped revenue in those sports, and that universities and the governing bodies of those sports, the Olympic governing bodies, are just not doing a very good job of monetizing those sports. But, the business is the business. And I think that a lot of these institutions, entire communities are built around them. And so universities really need to think about how they can tap those communities, their alumni, to be able to support these types of programs, especially because those student athletes in those Olympic sports turn out to be some of the best leaders and business people and doctors and lawyers and others that are coming out of this. I don't think as a country we can afford to have probably the number one leadership development program outside of the military go by the wayside because it doesn't make sense economically, or because the school says, well, our prerogative is to go dump money into football or basketball and not get a real return on investment. Maybe we make the NCAA tournament once every 10 or 20 years. As a Rutgers alum, I don't need to make the national championship in football. I'm happy if we can go 7-6. And I also know that we have a great, robust Olympic sports program where we're genuinely competitive, and it helps the rest of the athletics community more so than dump money into something that doesn't create any real return on investment.
Yeah, Jason, you're hitting something I've been thinking about a lot as a Stanford alum, where I feel like, football and basketball, that ship may have sailed, at least for the short term, but Stanford and other schools have long, as you say, long been successful in these Olympic sports. Stanford at an incredible rate. Is it possible in this moment to go upside down on this, to lessen the dollars that you have flowing to football and basketball, and say, okay, we're just gonna, we're gonna pay an average number, keep people coming that want to come to our school, but we're gonna really kill it in these Olympic sports. And as you say, explore ways to get greater revenues coming.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely, number one, there are schools that will decide to concentrate and say that we will focus more on the Olympic sports and become really, really
so?
good at that. We see that in baseball. We see that in softball.
Right.
I'll use Stanford as an example, and Cal. One of the problems is you can't tell me you don't have money, but then you're also fine with shipping your track team or cross country team across the country. It doesn't make sense. It's actually really stupid. And so perhaps we should be thinking about how we align these conferences in such a way that allows for these Olympic sports in particular to not have to have such an expensive cost structure. I mean, I'll use an example of Northern Illinois. They actually were smart. They said, you know what? Football makes us money. We're going to take football. We're going to move it into the Mountain West. And then we're going to take all of our other sports and move them into the Horizon League so they can go on a bus trip wherever they have to go. Right. And actually now they will become more competitive in both areas because it's logical and makes sense. So this whole concept of holding on to conference affiliation, I don't think people care, right? And, you know, as a Maryland alum, you know, when I think Maryland, I still think ACC. I still think those rivalries. I still think that if tomorrow Maryland said, hey, we're back in the ACC and we're playing Duke and North Carolina every Saturday, your fans would be like, great, right? Like, let's go. Let's have fun. So, and that ultimately will happen because if you have a consolidation of leagues, if you have a consolidation of the structure, it's going to turn out like football, fine. You want to fly around the country, but everybody else, they need to stay in their regions and lower costs and be realistic about how much, you know, you can fund. I can't imagine what like Oregon or Washington's Olympic sports travel bills are. It's probably insane. And it doesn't make sense financially. And I'm sure that all those kids would rather be hanging out playing teams where they're actually from. I remember last year or 2 years ago when UCLA, USC, Washington all left the Pac-12, I was talking to an SEC AD, and he said that this is the single greatest thing to ever happen to the SEC for Olympic sports because all of those kids from the West Coast are going to say, I am not going to Oregon anymore. I am not going to Washington to get on a flight on a Tuesday to go play Rutgers. I'm just going to go down to the SEC and know that I can go and have short travel, have a great student athlete experience, and do all those different things. And so maybe eventually those schools will recognize this is actually a better model if we figure out how to localize some of this.
You know, what's happened across on the college side and on the university side is they've created these new roles for general managers, which has really happened across, you know, basketball and football. What are your thoughts on that, and how will that continue to evolve over time?
Yeah, that's a great question. So number one, what even is a general manager? I mean, most of the people that are now general managers were operations people. Maybe they were a grad assistant. They're coaches that are, this is something that's needed. One of the problems is that there's not enough people at the higher levels where they're actually real GMs, right, in the NBA and the NFL that are willing to come down to the college level. There is no actual system that has been set up to actually educate these individuals, to upskill them, to train them in such a way that they have the capability to do that. And so what ends up happening is that these schools are just adding another line item without actually thinking through whether or not this makes sense. They're just like, oh, my competitor has a GM, so I'm going to have a GM. What do? I have no idea. You have to have some sort of process and through that to be able to accomplish it. And now they all have access to the same data in a lot of ways. They're all trying to get so where is that going to change, right? Again, the nature of college sports is that all of these schools are very reactive. They're not thoughtful in terms of what their process is to actually create differentiation. They don't do a whole lot when it comes to educating and upskilling their talent. They say, oh, great, you can go to NACTA and, you know, spend a week and hopefully take a couple of panels and you come back much smarter than you are. There has to be a real process. There's a reason why the NBA, the NFL invest into their talent and they can create a lot of money because there's a return on that. These schools can barely afford to pay their players and cover their bills. They're not thinking about it, accelerating their talent and figuring out how they can drive more. It's just a game of musical chairs. I'll just pick off somebody else and so on and so forth. Yeah, I am really looking forward to what happens at the end of this football season when you have 18 Big Ten schools and 16 SEC schools,
Right.
all who have spent $15 or $16 million on their football payrolls, and somebody wins 1 or 2 conference games. And what's going to be the excuse that the AD is going to say? Oh, well, we spend money, but we're going to fire our GM because he was terrible. But it was fine to go throw this investment, not thinking, maybe we should figure out whether or not we have a good system in place and the right people, and then invest the money into the players versus just throwing it at the wall and hoping something sticks.
I was going to say, absent a powerful NCAA, I mean, that ship's kind of sailed in terms of having this centralized league office, the
Right.
NBA and Teambo, and sending people out that know how to work and help you accelerate the ability of your people. Am I undercutting? Is the NCAA is that the new role of the NCAA?
The NCAA, that function has sailed, and so that is also why. And listen, I have many friends at the NCAA. I have deep respect for Baker, and that is a function of the league, and that will also become a function of the commercialized entities, the private equity and the private capital that come in and create aggregation across this. I mean, you use the word Teambo. I've spoken to multiple commissioners over the last couple of weeks, and I've like, why don't you have a Teambo? Why don't you pull in all of your multimedia rights partnerships under one umbrella and then go sell them? Like, why are you outsourcing 30% of your league's revenue to Learfield and Playfly? No offense, Mike, but he knows that too, right? You know, like that's just the reality of it. People have made businesses off the back of these programs. Learfield and Playfly and Van Wagner do not operate in the NBA, right? They don't need to because the NBA has figured out maybe that makes sense. The purpose of the NCAA at this point is to just organize championships, really, right? I mean, that's really what it comes down to. And eventually, if that function can be done cheaper or easier, the schools will decide that that's not something that they need either.
Yeah, I mean, it's really it's amazing what's happening right now, and I think one of the things that also is been an interesting thing. I mean, we just really touched on it a little bit from the general manager side of things, but also Jason, I mean, this new generation of athletic directors, right? I mean, what it really means to be an athletic director today. I mean, president of a university, as compared to what it used to be. I mean, it's a different kind of job.
Yeah. So there is no such thing as an all-encompassing AD position. In fact, I have said many times that every athletics department needs to have functionally 3 executive roles. One is maybe you call them the AD, and they are responsible for administration, maybe fundraising. You have a second individual that is responsible for player personnel, meaning the sort of GM of the product, as well as somebody that oversees the coaches and the coaching hiring. And then a third person that is focused on revenue. In the pro leagues, we see a similar model, right? The team president does not make player personnel decisions, and the general manager does not decide how much we should be selling in terms of tickets or sponsorship. It's not a novel concept. The problem is that there are some institutions, well, most institutions are operating in a very antiquated way. Now institutions are saying, oh, we have to switch it up. And so they're like, let's go hire the CRO of a professional baseball team, and they're going to come in and they're going to turn around and then they're not thinking through, do we have the administrative side actually buttoned up? Like, does this person actually know, does the sponsorship salesperson know what a competent general manager looks like in their program? So you have to focus on making sure that, hey, this is really good, and then we can fix this piece, and then we can fix that piece. If you try to go do it backwards, you're just going to run into your own self, and you're going to just create these challenges. I hate to say it, but look at my alma mater, Rutgers. They've been in the AD search for 6 months. I don't know if they know who they need or who they want or what the definition of the role is in this process. I will say that Maryland, interesting, right? They went and they hired somebody with a sales background. Then they went and poached a very high-level AD to come in and sort of be the secondary. That's an interesting model, and I think that could work potentially. But Maryland has their stuff together a lot more than a lot of these other institutions, and so that's going to be part of this natural evolution of who's going to figure it out and who's not. The last thing I'll say on this topic is that we have a very short period of time, right? The reality is that these major contracts are expiring in 2032. And so if you are an institution like my alma mater, if you can't figure out how to get it together within the next couple of years, you will be on the outside looking in when there is another realignment and the Super League or whatever is created. Because Rutgers and Maryland got into the Big Ten because they brought the DMV and the New York City market. Nobody cares about that anymore because nobody cares about linear television. It's all about eyeballs. And so if you have a bigger fan base and you have more people that are willing to buy an Amazon or Apple subscription, that's who's going to be in the Super League, not somebody that sits in a large media market.
Well, that's a really interesting point. And look, we're starting to wind down this special edition of our 76 Capital Sports Leadership Show. And it's been awesome having Jason Belzer on our show. I mean, if you hopefully get to this part of the show, you've heard some really interesting insights on what Jason has been doing and what he's really thinking about and what we need to do across college sports. Ken, take us home with sort of the last question here on the show.
Private equity. Traditionally, private equity grabs something, builds it up, sells it, and there's a big exit. How does this work in college sports? Will it work in college sports? What's the tweak that will finally, if it does, open up this space for these great amounts of capital that could really make changes? Could make it in a positive way. I'm trying to get a positive ending. Could make it a very positive way to get us to do all those things we're talking about that should be done to make this a better ecosystem for these young people.
Well, I can say that the model that some private equity firms are bringing to the table, which is a traditional debt credit model, is a bad model. And a bad model, I say, as on behalf of a university. If I'm a university, I should not be taking $100 million check and paying it at an 18% rate. And, you are mortgaging your future. There are other models that exist. There are models that our firm is deploying that is going to be different than that from a debt perspective. But I do think that once the ball starts, and I can't tell you how many schools, not just ones that we're talking to, but that, other larger institutions are talking to, that once one deal is done, everybody's going to be running towards the door, because you don't have to be first, but if you're last, you got no chance, because essentially what ends up happening is it's a clock. And if you're at the bottom of the line or at the back of the line, you are now a depreciating asset, because your competitor is taking on capital and is going to use that capital to accelerate what they're doing. They're going to accelerate their talent, their recruitment of high level talent, their development of that talent, and all of those different things. And so, unfortunately, not everybody is going to win. That is just a reality. And it's likely that the ones that are going to lose are going to be at institutions that have antiquated processes, conservative in their nature, to try new things. And the ones that are going to get ahead are going to be the ones that are going to be successful. Not too different than what we saw over the last couple of years with schools that were able to weaponize NIL very quickly, right? And build rosters because they were able to quickly figure out, hey, this is how we can put money in, this is how we can compensate our student athletes, and this is how we can build a program to be super competitive.
Thank you.
Well, Jason, it's been, again, awesome to have you on the show. What's the best way for people to follow you, watch you, hear all your sort of takes on the industry?
Yeah, so LinkedIn is probably the best place. I haven't posted as much on X anymore, but LinkedIn, I when I have something interesting to say, usually it's there. And my contact information is just jasonbelzer@gmail.com. It's easy to reach me. The phone number that I have is the same phone number I had in high school, so I don't think it's hard to find it out on the internet. If somebody really wants to send me a text, and sometimes they do, that's fine too. So I'm always willing to have conversations, and you can speak about all of this. I said a lot of the same things 5 years ago about NIL. Nobody believed me. I'm sure there are people that are going to listen to this and they're going to say Jason's full of you know what, and then 5 years from now they're going to be like, he was right, because he said he sees it and he saw where it was going. And that is the nature of college sports, unfortunately. And that is maybe the way that everything is going to happen now with artificial intelligence and everything. This is only going to accelerate, right? We're going to go from 0 to 1,000 very quickly. this industry is going to be unrecognizable from what it was 10 years ago pretty soon.
Well, last thing, will the fan base still be there?
I hope. I mean, listen, at the end of the day, I tell people there are only two things I know for certain. I'm a Jew and I'm a Rutgers alum, and I can't do anything to change that, really, right? And so the reality is that for most people, it's the same thing. You go to a school, you're always going to be a Maryland guy, right? Like, that is going to be in your blood. And with everything that is happening in our world, I think that's something important to hold on to be part of that community, to have that identity, to be able to tap into that fandom. And for a lot of, Maryland, Rutgers, big schools, but these little schools are holding a lot of these small communities together within our country. And that's really, really important. What we need now is unity. We need community. We need camaraderie. And that is, I think, why all of us are working in college sports, because we want to continue to make sure that happens. And for young people to have a path to develop themselves and become better people. And not everybody becomes a college athlete, but even just the dream and the hope and the goal of doing that helps a lot of kids get to college and help them as they move up through their life.
Well, thank you, Ken, and I really appreciate you coming on the show with us, and wish you the best of luck in all your endeavors.
Thank you guys for having me today.
Thanks a lot.
On behalf of our entire 76 Capital team, thank you for tuning in to this special college edition of our Sports Leadership Show. Please remember to subscribe to our show on your favorite podcast network or on the 76 Capital website. You can also explore the hundreds of episodes we've produced over the past several years on those same networks. And as always, go out there and make it happen.